All right, let's get into it. Think about the global pharmaceutical system for a second. That huge, complex network that gets life-saving medicines from the factory all the way to patients. Now, imagine that system is a person. On the outside, it looks like it's doing its job, but deep down, it's suffering from a really serious and often totally invisible illness: corruption. So today, we're going to play doctor. We're going to look at how we can diagnose and maybe even cure this very sick system. So just how sick are we talking? Well, the scale of the problem is, honestly, it's staggering. It's estimated that a massive 10 to 25% of all the money spent on public procurement globally is just lost to corruption. That's money that was supposed to go to schools, to roads, and yeah, to healthcare. And since medicine is such a huge chunk of public budgets, it's a prime target.
But this isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. No, there's a devastating human cost here. And the World Bank puts it really bluntly: when that money disappears, or when fake drugs flood the market, it's the most vulnerable people who get hit the hardest. We're talking about the folks who rely completely on public health systems. They're the ones who pay the ultimate price.
So, how do you even begin to treat an illness that's this complicated and this hidden? Well, like with any patient, the very first step is getting a proper diagnosis. And that is exactly where the World Health Organization comes in with this really incredible initiative called the Good Governance for Medicines Program. You'll see it called GGM.
The GGM program, which kicked off back in 2004, has one clear mission: fight corruption in order to make health systems stronger. And it's not just about, writing a bunch of new laws. It's about helping countries build systems that are transparent and creating a culture where doing the right thing is just the default.
Now, here's the genius of the GGM program. This is the real game changer. They realize that trying to count every single bribe or shady deal is pretty much impossible. So instead, they focus on something way more practical. They assess how vulnerable the system is to corruption in the first place. It's like checking the foundation of a house for cracks before it falls down. And to do this, the WHO uses a really clear three-phase process. It's pretty straightforward. First, they help a country assess its own system, find those cracks, those weak spots. Then they get everyone in a room, all the key players, to develop a national plan for good governance. And finally, they help implement that new, much stronger system. Assess, develop, implement. Okay, so they've got this powerful diagnostic tool. What did they actually find when they started using it? Well, the results from the first 25 countries that went through this process, they paint a really clear picture of the most common symptoms. And the findings were fascinating and in some ways really surprising. The one area that time and again showed up as the most vulnerable to corruption was controlling how medicines are promoted and marketed. And on the flip side, the area that looked the strongest, at least on paper, was how pharmaceuticals are actually purchased, the procurement process. This table really shows you that contrast in stark detail. Just look at that top row for extremely or very vulnerable. For medicine promotion, 10 out of 21 countries were in deep trouble. But look at procurement, only 1 out of 25. So what does that tell us? It suggests that a lot of countries have pretty solid rules for buying medicines, but when it comes to overseeing the marketing, well, that's where things get dangerously weak. And as they looked closer, the same kinds of symptoms just kept showing up again and again. Things like a basic lack of public information. The laws might exist, but nobody's enforcing them. There are no real conflict of interest policies for the people making huge decisions. And you see these simple governance failures, like not even having clear rules for who gets to be on an important committee. And this quote from the WHO report really zeroes in on one of the biggest failures. In a lot of places, even if there were rules about conflicts of interest, nobody had to follow them, and they didn't cover everyone. I mean, in one country they looked at, public officials had to disclose conflicts, but private consultants on the exact same committees didn't. That is a massive loophole you could drive a truck through. Okay. So we've diagnosed the illness, we've identified the symptoms. It all sounds a bit grim, doesn't it? But what about the cure? Is there a prescription? Absolutely. Let's look at it in action with an incredible success story from Thailand, which was one of the very first countries to go through all 3 phases of the GGM program. So one of the first things Thailand did was make huge improvements in procurement. They set up what's called a pooled purchasing scheme, which basically means a bunch of hospitals could buy their medicines together. Such a simple idea, right? But by collaborating, they used better practices, they could negotiate much better prices, and they ended up saving a ton of money, all while making sure the medicines were high quality. And they didn't stop there. They went after the transparency problem hard. They created newsletters, brochures, and websites to get information out to the public. They started publishing the minutes from their big national medicine meetings. They even added good governance to the curriculum at the country's pharmacy schools. I mean, talk about building a new ethical foundation from the ground up.
And all these changes started to create these positive ripples that spread everywhere. The GGM program led to a complete review of their national pharmaceutical laws. It got the Ministry of Public Health, universities, and the Thai FDA all working together better. It just created a more strategic, more transparent way of managing the entire system.
Thailand's story is so important because it proves that recovery is possible. You can cure this illness. So what's the path forward for other countries? What are the big challenges and priorities to get this sick system healthy for good?
And here is maybe the most hopeful finding in the entire WHO report. It turns out that many of the most effective fixes, things like writing clear rules for committees or making conflict of interest forms mandatory, they aren't expensive. In fact, they're often super low cost and pretty easy to put into practice. The biggest barrier isn't money, it's political will.
But easy to implement doesn't mean it just happens on its own. Success really boils down to a few key things. You absolutely need political support from the very top. You need everyone, the private sector, civil society, working together. You have to build new leaders and skills. And, maybe most importantly, you need to stick with it. This isn't a quick fix. It is a long-term treatment plan. And that brings us to the final, and I think, the most important question of all. The WHO has shown us that the cure is within reach. The reforms that can have a huge impact are simple and affordable. So if we know that, and we choose to do nothing, what is the real cost, in lives, in trust, in wasted potential, of just letting this system stay sick?